The ledger told one story: 250 souls accounted for at dawn roll call on March 14, 1847. The same ledger, reviewed at dusk that same day, told another: 0. Not escaped, not deceased, simply absent, as if they had never existed at all. The Riverside Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of Virginia bottomland, its boundaries marked by the James River to the east and dense pine forest to the west. For 32 years, it had operated with mechanical precision under the Hargrove family, producing tobacco and corn in quantities that made Richmond merchants wealthy. The plantation's records were meticulous, every bushel, every birth, every death documented in leather-bound books kept in the main house's library. These records would later become evidence in one of the most perplexing investigations in antebellum Virginia history. What makes this case extraordinary isn't simply the number of people who vanished, it's the completeness of their disappearance. 250 individuals, men, women, children, the elderly, gone in the span of a single hour, leaving behind no footprints in the mud, no broken fences, no stolen provisions. The overseer's daily report, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, contains a single notation for March 14th. All quarters found empty at evening inspection. No signs of disturbance. No explanation. Before we continue with the story of what happened at Riverside Plantation and the decades-long mystery that followed, understand this: what you're about to hear has been deliberately obscured from historical record. The investigation that followed involved state officials, federal marshals, and private investigators hired by insurance companies who had underwritten the plantation's considerable value. Their findings were never published. The documents were sealed. The witnesses who spoke publicly were discredited. And the town that was allegedly built by those who disappeared. It existed for less than 3 years before it too vanished from maps and memory. This is the story of how 250 people orchestrated the impossible, and why the truth was buried for over a century. To understand what happened at Riverside, you must first understand what it was. The plantation had been established in 1815 by William Hargrove's father, Thomas, who had purchased the land from a tobacco merchant fallen on hard times. The elder Hargrove had been a methodical man, obsessed with efficiency and record-keeping. He had designed the plantation's layout himself, positioning the quarters in a location that could be observed from the main house, ensuring that the work buildings were arranged for maximum productivity and establishing routines that governed every aspect of plantation life. When William inherited the estate in 1835, he maintained his father's systems with religious devotion. Every morning began with roll call at 6 o'clock. Every evening ended with an inspection of the quarters at 8. Meals were served at precise times. Work assignments were posted on a board outside the overseer's cottage. Punishments for infractions were documented in a separate ledger, with dates, offenses, and consequences recorded in William's careful handwriting. The main house was a 3-story structure of red brick, with white columns supporting a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. From the second-floor windows, one could see across the entire plantation: the quarters to the north, the tobacco fields to the south, the cornfields to the west, and the river glinting in the distance to the east. William's study occupied the southeast corner of the second floor, positioned so he could observe both the quarters and the main work areas without leaving his desk. Catherine Hargrove, William's wife, managed the domestic operations with similar precision. She had been raised on a plantation in South Carolina and brought with her firm ideas about how a household should be run. The main house staff consisted of 12 individuals who lived in a separate building behind the kitchen: cooks, housemaids, a butler, a laundress, and personal servants for the family members. Catherine kept her own set of records, documenting the household's daily operations in a series of journals that she had maintained since her marriage in 1828. The Hargrove children: William Jr., age 32, Thomas, age 29, and Elizabeth, age 26, had all been raised on the plantation and had absorbed their parents' attitudes and methods. William Jr. managed the tobacco operation, Thomas oversaw the corn production and livestock, and Elizabeth, unmarried and living at home, assisted her mother with household management and served as the plantation's unofficial schoolteacher for the family's younger relatives and the children of neighboring plantation owners. By all accounts, the Hargroves considered themselves enlightened owners. They provided adequate food and clothing, allowed religious services in the chapel every Sunday, and rarely resorted to the harshest forms of punishment that were common on other estates. William frequently remarked to visitors that a well-treated laborer is a productive laborer, and he believed his plantation's consistent profitability proved the wisdom of this approach. What the Hargroves failed to recognize, what they were constitutionally incapable of recognizing, was that beneath the surface of compliance and routine, an entirely separate world existed. A world of whispered conversations, coded messages, and careful planning. A world that had been building toward March 14, 1847 for years. The population of Riverside in early 1847 was remarkably diverse, a consequence of Thomas Hargrove's purchasing practices and William's later acquisitions. This diversity would prove crucial to what happened, though the Hargroves never understood why. Among the oldest residents was a man named Samuel, who had been born in Africa and brought to America in 1804, before the legal importation of slaves was prohibited. He was in his 60s by 1847, his hair completely white, his body bent from decades of labor, but his mind remained sharp, and he served as an unofficial elder and advisor to the community. Samuel spoke multiple African languages and served as a bridge between the African-born residents and those born in America. He also possessed knowledge of herbal medicine, navigation by stars, and oral history preservation, skills that would prove invaluable. Then there was Marcus, the head carpenter, who had been purchased from a Baltimore estate in 1829. Marcus was 53 years old in 1847, a man of medium height with powerful shoulders and hands, scarred from decades of working with wood and metal. He had been trained by a master craftsman in Baltimore and possessed skills that went far beyond simple carpentry. He could read architectural drawings, calculate structural loads, and solve complex engineering problems. The Hargroves valued him highly for his ability to construct and repair buildings, furniture, and equipment. They had no idea that he had been using those same skills for an entirely different purpose. Marcus had a wife, Hannah, and 3 children, 2 daughters, Rachel and Sarah, ages 19 and 16, and a son, David, age 14. Hannah worked in the main house as a seamstress, a position that gave her access to information about the family's plans and visitors. Rachel and Sarah worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, and in the main house during winter months. David worked in the carpentry shop with his father, learning the trade. Dinah, the head cook, was 46 years old and had been at Riverside since 1833. She had been purchased from a Virginia estate after her previous owner died and his property was liquidated. Dinah was a woman of considerable intelligence and force of personality. She managed a kitchen staff of 4 and was responsible for feeding not only the Hargrove family, but also preparing the communal meals for the quarters. This gave her control over food supplies and the ability to redirect resources without arousing suspicion. She was also one of the few people who could move freely between the main house and the quarters at almost any time, carrying messages and information under the guise of her duties. Benjamin, the stable hand, was 21 years old and had been born on the plantation. He was the son of a woman named Grace, who had died in childbirth when Benjamin was born. He had been raised collectively by the community, with no single parent figure, which had given him a certain independence of spirit that the overseer found troublesome. Benjamin was responsible for maintaining the plantation's horses and for driving the wagon on trips to Richmond and neighboring towns to purchase supplies or deliver goods. These trips had given him knowledge of roads, towns, and the broader geography of Virginia that few others at Riverside possessed. There was also a woman named Esther, age 38, who worked as a midwife and healer. She had been born in South Carolina and purchased by William Hargrove in 1840. Esther had learned medicine from her mother and grandmother, and she possessed extensive knowledge of herbs, treatments for common ailments, and the management of childbirth. She was trusted by both the enslaved community and, to some extent, by the Hargrove family, who occasionally consulted her when their own physicians were unavailable. This trust gave her a degree of freedom of movement and access to information that others lacked. Among the younger generation was a man named Joseph, aged 27, who worked in the blacksmith's forge. Joseph had been purchased from a Maryland estate in 1842 and brought with him skills in metalworking that made him valuable to the plantation's operations. He could repair tools, shoe horses, and fabricate metal components for equipment and buildings. He was quiet and kept largely to himself, which led the Hargroves to consider him simple-minded. In reality, Joseph was highly intelligent and had been using his position to create tools and implements that would be needed for purposes the Hargroves never imagined. There were many others, each with their own skills, knowledge, and roles in the community. There was Ruth, a woman in her 50s who organized the Sunday religious services and maintained the chapel. There was Jacob, a man in his 40s who managed the vegetable gardens that supplemented the community's diet. There was Miriam, a young woman of 23 who worked in the main house and had taught herself to read by secretly studying books in the Hargrove library. There was Thomas, not to be confused with Thomas Hargrove, a man in his 30s who worked in the tobacco fields and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the surrounding forests from years of hunting to supplement the community's food supply. Each of these individuals and dozens of others had been carefully observed and evaluated by Marcus, Dinah, Samuel, and a small core group who had been planning the escape for years. Each had been assigned specific roles based on their skills, knowledge, and trustworthiness, and each had been preparing in their own way for the night of March 13, 1847. The planning for the escape had begun in the winter of 1842-1843, though its roots went back even further. The catalyst had been a conversation between Marcus and Samuel, the two oldest and most respected men in the community. It had been a cold January night, and Marcus had been working late in his shop, repairing a wagon wheel by lamplight. Samuel had appeared at the door, moving quietly despite his age, and had asked if they could speak privately. What followed was a conversation that would change the course of 250 lives. Samuel had begun by asking Marcus a simple question. If you could leave this place, where would you go? Marcus had been startled by the directness of the question. Such conversations were dangerous. Even speaking of escape could result in severe punishment if overheard. But something in Samuel's tone suggested this was not idle speculation. North, Marcus had replied carefully. To a free state. Pennsylvania, maybe. Or further. Samuel had nodded slowly. And how would you get there? I don't know. The roads are watched. The river is patrolled. And even if I made it, I'm one man. What about Hannah? What about my children? What if it wasn't just you? Samuel had asked. What if it was all of us? Marcus had stared at the old man, trying to determine if he was serious or if age had finally affected his judgment. All of us? That's impossible. 250 people can't just disappear. Where would we go? How would we travel? How would we eat? Those are good questions, Samuel had said. Questions that need answers. But first, answer this. Is it impossible because it truly cannot be done? Or is it impossible because we've been taught to believe it cannot be done? That conversation had planted a seed. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself thinking about Samuel's question. He began to observe the plantation with new eyes, not as a place where he was trapped, but as a problem to be solved. How were they contained? What were the actual barriers to escape? What resources did they have access to? What knowledge did they possess collectively that could be applied to the problem? He began to have quiet conversations with others he trusted. Dinah, who controlled food supplies. Benjamin, who knew the roads and geography. Joseph, who could fabricate tools. Esther, who understood medicine and could treat injuries or illness during a journey. Ruth, who could organize and motivate people. Each conversation was careful, oblique, never stating the ultimate goal explicitly, but feeling out whether the person could be trusted and what they might contribute. By the spring of 1843, a core group of about 15 people had formed. They met in small groups, never all together, usually during the Sunday religious services when conversation was expected and less likely to be monitored. They began to develop what would eventually become the plan. The first major decision was about destination. The initial assumption had been that they would flee north, to free states or Canada. But as they discussed the logistics, the problems became apparent. The distance was enormous, hundreds of miles. The route would take them through populated areas where they would be conspicuous. Even if they reached free territory, they would be fugitives, subject to recapture under federal law. And the journey would be especially difficult for the elderly, the very young, and the infirm. It was Samuel who proposed the alternative. What if we didn't run away? What if we disappeared? The distinction seemed subtle, but it was crucial. Running away meant fleeing to somewhere else, somewhere known, somewhere that could be pursued. Disappearing meant vanishing so completely that pursuit would be impossible because no one would know where to look. "Where can 250 people disappear to?" Marcus had asked. "Somewhere no one would think to look," Samuel had replied. "Somewhere close, somewhere in Virginia itself." The idea seemed absurd at first. Virginia was slave territory. Staying in Virginia meant staying in danger. But as Samuel explained his reasoning, the logic became clear. Everyone would expect them to flee north. Resources would be directed toward searching northern routes. If they instead went west, into the mountains, and found a remote location where they could establish themselves, they might remain hidden long enough to organize a more permanent solution. Benjamin, who had traveled through the western parts of Virginia on supply runs, confirmed that there were vast stretches of mountainous territory that were sparsely populated and difficult to access. "There are valleys in those mountains that no one ever goes to," he said. "Too remote for farming, too rough for roads. If we could find one of those valleys, we could hide there." This became the foundation of the plan. Escape from Riverside, travel west to the mountains, establish a hidden settlement, and use that as a base while they organize the next phase, whatever that might be. But this still left the enormous problem of how to actually escape from Riverside. The plantation was not a prison, but it was controlled. The quarters were fenced. The gates were locked at night. The overseer made regular rounds. The surrounding area was populated with other plantations whose owners would report any large groups of unfamiliar people. How could 250 people leave without being seen? It was Marcus who proposed the solution that would define the entire operation. We go under. The idea of a tunnel was both brilliant and audacious. It solved the fundamental problem of how to move a large group of people past the plantation's boundaries without being observed. But it created an entirely new set of challenges. How do you dig a tunnel without being discovered? Where do you put the excavated earth? How do you support the tunnel to prevent collapse? How do you ventilate it? How do you hide the entrance and exit? Marcus spent months thinking through these problems before he even proposed the idea to the core planning group. He made sketches on scraps of wood that he burned after studying them. He calculated distances, angles, and volumes. He estimated how much earth would need to be moved and how long it would take. He identified the tools that would be needed and how they could be obtained or fabricated without arousing suspicion. When he finally presented the plan to the group in the fall of 1843, their initial reaction was that it was impossible. The tunnel would need to be at least half a mile long to reach beyond the plantation's boundaries. It would need to be tall enough for people to walk through, which meant moving an enormous volume of earth. It would require timber supports, which would need to be obtained and installed. And all of this would need to be done in secret, at night, while maintaining the appearance of normal plantation life during the day. "It's impossible," Dinah had said flatly. "Probably," Marcus had agreed. "But what's our alternative?" That question hung in the air. They had no alternative. Every other option they had considered, Fleeing by road by river through the forests had insurmountable problems. The tunnel was impossible, but it was the only impossible plan that had any chance of success. How long would it take? Samuel had asked. 4 years, Marcus had said. Maybe 5. If we work every night that we can, if we're careful, if we're lucky. 4 years. It seemed like an eternity, but they had already waited lifetimes. What was 4 more years if it meant freedom? The group agreed to attempt it. They would begin in the spring of 1844 as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. They would work in shifts, with different people taking turns so that no one would be too exhausted to perform their regular duties during the day. They would use the Sunday religious services to coordinate and communicate, and they would tell no one outside the core group until the tunnel was complete, and they were ready to execute the escape. The location of the tunnel entrance was chosen carefully. Marcus's cabin was on the eastern edge of the quarters, closest to the river. It was also one of the larger cabins, housing Marcus's family and 2 other families, 11 people in total. The cabin had a wooden floor, which was unusual. Most of the quarters had dirt floors. Marcus had built the floor himself years earlier, and the Hargroves had approved it as an example of the kind of improvement that industrious workers could achieve. What the Hargroves didn't know was that Marcus had built the floor with a hidden access panel. A section of floorboards in the corner of the cabin could be lifted to reveal the earth beneath. This would become the entrance to the tunnel. The first night of digging was in April 1844. 6 men, Marcus, Joseph, Benjamin, Thomas the field worker, and 2 others named Daniel and William, gathered in Marcus's cabin after the evening inspection. They moved quietly, speaking in whispers, their movements careful and deliberate. Marcus lifted the floor panel, revealing a square of earth about 3 feet on each side. They began to dig. The work was brutally difficult. The earth was dense clay mixed with rocks and roots. They had only basic tools, a few shovels, a pickaxe, a pry bar that had been carefully hidden in the carpentry shop. They could make noise, but not too much. The overseer's cottage was 100 yards away and sound carried at night. They could use lamps, but only dim ones, and only inside the cabin with the windows covered. That first night, they dug down about 3 feet and removed perhaps half a cubic yard of earth. The earth was placed in burlap sacks and hidden under the cabin's floorboards. The next day, during regular work activities, the sacks were emptied in small quantities across the plantation, mixed into the vegetable gardens, spread in the tobacco fields, dumped in the compost heaps. No single location received enough earth to be noticeable. This became the pattern. Dig at night, dispose of earth during the day. Slowly, painfully, the shaft descended into the ground. After 2 weeks, they had reached a depth of about 12 feet. At this point, Marcus made the decision to begin tunneling horizontally, angling slightly upward to maintain drainage and prevent flooding. The tunnel would head east toward the river, but would curve slightly north to emerge in a ravine that Benjamin had identified as a suitable exit point. The horizontal tunneling was even more difficult than the vertical shaft. They were working in a confined space, lying on their stomachs or crouching, passing buckets of earth backward to be hauled up the shaft. The air was stale and difficult to breathe. The darkness was absolute, except for the small lamps they used. The constant fear of collapse was exhausting, but they persisted. Night after night, week after week, month after month, the tunnel extended eastward. Marcus designed and built a simple ventilation system using hollow reeds that extended from the tunnel to the surface, disguised as natural vegetation. Joseph fabricated metal brackets and supports in the blacksmith shop, claiming they were for various plantation projects, and these were installed in the tunnel to reinforce the walls and ceiling. Timber supports were cut from trees in the forest, ostensibly for firewood or construction projects, and were secretly diverted to the tunnel. By the end of 1844, the tunnel extended about 200 feet from the shaft. By the end of 1845, it had reached 400 feet. The work was taking longer than Marcus had initially estimated. The earth was more difficult than expected, the ventilation problems were more severe, and the physical toll on the workers was greater than anticipated. Several times they had to stop work for weeks to allow injuries to heal or to address structural problems in the tunnel. But they kept going. The core group expanded slightly as more people were brought into the secret and assigned roles. Some worked on the tunnel itself. Others focused on gathering supplies, food that could be preserved, clothing that could be hidden, tools that would be needed for the journey and for establishing a settlement. Still others worked on intelligence gathering, learning about the geography of Western Virginia, identifying potential routes, making contact with people who might help. Dinah used her position to slowly accumulate extra food supplies. She would request slightly more than needed for the main house, and the excess would be preserved and hidden. Salt, dried beans, smoked meat, flour, all accumulated in small quantities that wouldn't be missed individually but that added up over months and years to a substantial stockpile. Hannah, working as a seamstress in the main house, made extra clothing and blankets, claiming they were needed for repairs or replacements. These were hidden away for the journey. Benjamin, on his trips to Richmond and other towns, carefully observed and memorized routes, landmarks, and the locations of towns and settlements. He also made discreet contact with free black communities and learned about networks of people who helped fugitives. Esther prepared medical supplies, herbs, bandages, remedies for common ailments and injuries that might occur during the journey. Ruth organized a system of communication using songs and coded phrases during religious services. Different hymns or variations in how they were sung conveyed information about the tunnel's progress, problems that needed to be addressed, or changes in the plan. By the winter of 1846-1847, the tunnel was nearly complete. It extended over 800 feet from the entrance shaft to an exit point in a ravine about 300 yards from the river. The exit was carefully concealed behind a false rock face that Marcus had constructed using his carpentry skills. From the outside, it appeared to be a natural rock formation. Only someone who knew exactly where to look and what to look for would be able to find it. The tunnel itself was a remarkable achievement. It was about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough for people to walk through in a crouch or crawl through if necessary. The walls and ceiling were supported by timber frames every 6 feet. The floor was relatively level, with a slight upward slope toward the exit to prevent water accumulation. Small chambers had been carved into the walls at intervals, providing places to rest or store supplies. The ventilation system, while crude, was functional. The hollow reeds extended from the tunnel to the surface at multiple points, disguised as natural vegetation or hidden in areas of dense undergrowth. The air in the tunnel was stale and difficult to breathe, but it was sufficient for the short time people would need to spend there. In February 1847, Marcus called a meeting of the core planning group. "It's done," he said simply. "The tunnel is complete. Now we need to decide when to use it." The decision of when to execute the escape was as critical as the planning itself. It needed to be a time when conditions were optimal, weather suitable for travel, ground conditions passable, and timing that would give them the maximum head start before the disappearance was discovered. The core group debated for weeks. Some argued for waiting until summer, when the weather would be warmest and travel easiest. Others pointed out that summer meant longer days, which meant less darkness for travel and more chance of being seen. Some suggested fall, after the harvest, when food would be most plentiful. Others noted that fall meant the approach of winter, which could be dangerous in the mountains. Samuel, drawing on his decades of experience and observation, proposed early spring. "The ground is soft enough to travel," he explained. "The weather is cool, which means we can travel during the day if we're in remote areas without risking heat exhaustion. The days are getting longer, but it's still dark enough at night for the initial escape, and it's before planting season, which means the Hargroves will be focused on preparation, not on watching us as closely." The group agreed. Early spring it would be, but which day specifically? Benjamin suggested March 13th. "It's a Saturday," he explained. "The Hargroves always have a social gathering on Saturday evenings, dinner with neighbors or family from Richmond. They'll be distracted." The overseer usually drinks on Saturday nights after his rounds, and Sunday is our day for religious services, which means we're expected to be up early anyway. If we leave Saturday night, we'll have all of Sunday before they realize we're gone. This logic was sound. March 13th, 1847 became the target date. But this created a new problem: how to inform 250 people of the plan without the information leaking to the Hargroves or the overseer. The core group had been small, about 20 people who knew the full details of the tunnel and the escape plan. Everyone else knew only that something was being planned, but not what or when. Ruth developed a system for the final communication. During the religious service on Sunday, March 7th, 1 week before the escape, she would lead the congregation in a specific hymn that had been chosen months earlier as the signal. The hymn was "Go Down Moses," a song about liberation from bondage that was commonly sung in the quarters. But Ruth would sing it with a specific variation in the third verse, changing one word in a way that would be meaningful to those who had been prepared to listen for it, but would seem like a natural variation to anyone else. After the service, the core group members would quietly spread the word to specific individuals who would in turn inform others. The message was simple: Saturday night. Be ready. Bring nothing. Tell no one outside the community. The week between March 7th and March 13th was the most tense period of the entire 4-year planning process. Everyone knew that discovery at this stage would be catastrophic. They had to maintain absolute normalcy in their behavior while simultaneously preparing for the escape. Marcus and his team made final inspections of the tunnel, reinforcing weak points and ensuring the ventilation system was functioning. Dinah and her team moved the accumulated food supplies to a hidden location near the tunnel exit, where they could be quickly loaded for transport. Benjamin and others who would serve as guides reviewed the routes one final time. Esther prepared medical kits for the journey. Ruth organized the order in which people would enter the tunnel, prioritizing families with young children and the elderly, who would move most slowly. The Hargroves noticed nothing unusual. William commented in his journal on March 11th that the people seem in good spirits, anticipating spring planting. Catherine noted on March 12th that Dinah had prepared an especially fine dinner and that the household staff performed their duties with unusual efficiency. On the evening of March 13th, everything proceeded normally. The Hargroves hosted a dinner party for several neighboring plantation owners and their families. The meal was elaborate, prepared by Dinah and her kitchen staff. The overseer, Gerald Pritchard, made his evening rounds at 8 o'clock as always, walking through the quarters and noting that all seemed quiet and orderly. He returned to his cottage and, as was his custom on Saturday nights, poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled in for the evening. In the quarters, people prepared in silence. They wore their sturdiest clothing and shoes. They gathered their children and explained in whispers that they needed to be absolutely quiet. The elderly and infirm were helped by younger, stronger individuals. Everyone waited for the signal. At 9 o'clock, Marcus emerged from his cabin and walked slowly through the quarters as if taking an evening stroll. As he passed each cabin, he gave a slight nod. This was the signal. It was time. The escape began at 9:15 p.m. on March 13, 1847. The moon was a thin crescent, providing minimal light, exactly as planned. The temperature was cool but not cold, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. A light breeze rustled through the trees, providing ambient noise that would help mask any sounds of movement. The first group to enter the tunnel consisted of Marcus, Samuel, Benjamin, and 3 other men who would serve as guides and scouts. They descended through the shaft in Marcus's cabin and moved quickly through the tunnel to the exit. Their job was to ensure the exit was clear and to begin scouting the immediate area beyond the plantation boundaries. They emerged from the tunnel into the ravine at 9:35 p.m. The false rock face that concealed the exit swung open smoothly on hinges that Joseph had fabricated. The ravine was dark and silent. Benjamin climbed to the top of the ravine and scanned the surrounding area. No lights were visible, no sounds of human activity. They were alone. Marcus returned through the tunnel to signal that the exit was clear. At 9:45 p.m., the main exodus began. The order of departure had been carefully planned. Families with young children went first, so they would have the most time to travel before dawn. The elderly and infirm went next, accompanied by younger people who could assist them. The middle-aged and able-bodied went last, as they could move most quickly if time became short. The tunnel could accommodate about 10 people at a time, moving in a crouch or crawl. Each group took approximately 10 minutes to traverse the 800 feet from entrance to exit. This meant that the entire population of 250 people would require about 4 hours to pass through the tunnel, from 9:45 p.m. to approximately 1:45 a.m. The operation proceeded with remarkable efficiency. People moved in silence, their movements practiced from the rehearsals that had been conducted under the guise of nighttime religious gatherings. Parents carried small children. Older children held hands and followed their parents. The elderly were supported by younger relatives or neighbors. Everyone knew their place in the order and moved when signaled. At the exit, Benjamin and the other scouts organized people into groups of about 25. Each group was assigned a guide who knew the route. The groups would travel separately, taking slightly different paths to avoid creating an obvious trail and to reduce the risk that the entire population would be captured if one group was discovered. The first group departed the ravine at 10 p.m., heading west into the forest. The second group left at 10:30 p.m., the third at 11 p.m. By midnight, 5 groups had departed, and the tunnel was still moving people from the quarters to the exit point. In the quarters themselves, the evacuation was proceeding exactly as planned. Each cabin emptied in turn, with people moving silently to Marcus's cabin and descending through the shaft. The cabins were left neat and orderly, with bedding folded and personal items in place. Nothing was taken except what people wore and could carry in small bundles. The goal was to leave no evidence of hasty departure. Ruth was one of the last to leave, at approximately 1:30 a.m. Before descending into the tunnel, she took a final look around the quarters that had been her home for 14 years. The cabins stood silent in the darkness. The chapel where she had led so many services was empty. The vegetable gardens where she had worked were still. Everything looked normal, as if people were simply sleeping and would emerge at dawn for another day of labor. But they wouldn't. By dawn, they would be miles away, and the quarters would be empty. Ruth descended into the tunnel and made her way to the exit. She emerged into the ravine at 1:45 a.m. and was met by Marcus, who had been waiting to ensure everyone made it through safely. "Everyone?" she asked quietly. "Everyone," Marcus confirmed. 250 souls, all free. The last group, which included Marcus, Ruth, Dinah, and several others from the core planning group, departed the ravine at 2:10 a.m. Marcus took a final look at the tunnel exit, then carefully closed the false rock face. From the outside, it once again appeared to be nothing more than a natural rock formation. They turned west and disappeared into the forest. Behind them, Riverside Plantation slept. The main house was dark. The overseer's cottage showed a single lamp in the window, which would burn until Pritchard fell asleep. The quarters were silent and empty. At 5:45 a.m., Gerald Pritchard would emerge from his cottage and walk toward the quarters to conduct the morning roll call. At 6 a.m., he would ring the bell and wait for people to emerge. At 6:05 a.m., he would begin to realize that something was wrong. At 6:15 a.m., he would be running toward the main house to wake William Hargrove with news that would shock Virginia and create a mystery that would endure for over a century. But that was still hours away. For now, 250 people were moving through the darkness, heading west toward the mountains and toward freedom. The groups traveled separately, but along roughly parallel routes, all heading generally west-northwest toward the Allegheny Mountains. The routes had been scouted over the previous 2 years by Benjamin and others who had been able to travel on plantation business. They avoided roads and towns, instead following game trails, creek beds, and ridgelines that provided natural navigation markers. The first group, led by Benjamin, consisted of 25 people, including several families with young children. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest and to ensure no one was left behind. Benjamin navigated by the stars, which he had learned to read from Samuel, and by landmarks he had memorized from his scouting trips. The forest was dense and dark. The thin crescent moon provided almost no light, and they dared not use torches or lanterns for fear of being seen. They moved by feel, holding on to each other, following the person in front, trusting Benjamin to lead them true. A child began to cry about an hour into the journey. The mother quickly comforted the child, but the sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Benjamin called a halt and gathered the group. "We need to be silent," he whispered. "I know it's hard, especially for the little ones, but sound carries at night. We're still too close to the plantation. In a few more hours, we'll be far enough away that we can rest and make some noise. But for now, we must be silent." The group continued. The child, comforted by his mother and exhausted from the excitement and fear, fell asleep and was carried the rest of the night. The second group, led by Thomas the field worker, consisted mostly of younger adults without children. They moved faster than Benjamin's group, covering ground quickly. Thomas led them along a creek bed, using the sound of running water to mask any noise they made, and following the creek's course westward. The third group, led by a man named Peter, who had worked in the stables with Benjamin, included several elderly individuals. They moved slowly, stopping frequently for rest. Peter was patient, never rushing them, understanding that their pace was limited by the physical capabilities of the oldest members. The fourth and fifth groups, led by other scouts, followed similar patterns, moving west, avoiding detection, staying silent, helping each other through the darkness. By dawn, the groups had covered between 8 and 12 miles, depending on their pace. As the sky began to lighten in the east, the group leaders called halts and found concealed locations where they could rest during the day. They chose dense thickets, small caves, or areas of heavy undergrowth where they could hide from any travelers who might pass nearby. The people were exhausted. Many had never walked more than a few miles at a time in their lives. Their feet were blistered, their muscles ached, and they were hungry and thirsty. But they were also exhilarated. For the first time in their lives, they were free. They had escaped. They had done the impossible. Benjamin's group found a small hollow surrounded by dense laurel bushes. They crawled into the hollow and collapsed in exhaustion. Benjamin posted 2 people as lookouts, then allowed himself to rest. He calculated that they were about 10 miles from Riverside. If the disappearance had been discovered at dawn as expected, any search would be focused on the immediate area around the plantation. They were probably safe for now, as the sun rose on March 14, 1847, 250 people lay hidden in forests and hollows across western Virginia. They slept fitfully, unused to sleeping during the day, anxious about what would happen next, but sustained by the knowledge that they had taken the first step toward freedom. Behind them, at Riverside Plantation, Gerald Pritchard was discovering the empty quarters and running to wake William Hargrove with impossible news. The journey to the mountains took 13 days. The groups traveled only at night, hiding during the day in whatever concealment they could find. They moved slowly, limited by the pace of the elderly and the young children, and by the need to avoid detection. The route took them through some of the most remote territory in Virginia. They crossed the James River on the second night, using a ford that Benjamin had identified during his scouting. The water was cold and the current was strong, but everyone made it across safely. They continued west, climbing gradually into the foothills of the Alleghenies. Food was a constant concern. The supplies that had been hidden near the tunnel exit had been distributed among the groups, but it was not enough to sustain 250 people for 2 weeks. They supplemented their supplies by foraging, gathering wild plants, catching fish in streams, and occasionally hunting small game. Esther's knowledge of edible plants proved invaluable, as did the hunting skills of several men who had experience providing food for the quarters. Water was less of a problem. The route followed streams and rivers for much of the way, providing ample fresh water. But the constant walking in wet conditions led to problems with blistered and infected feet. Esther treated these injuries as best she could with the limited medical supplies she had brought, but several people developed serious infections that slowed their travel. On the fifth night, they had their first serious scare. One of the groups, led by Peter, was moving along a ridgeline when they heard dogs barking in the distance. The sound was unmistakable. Bloodhounds, the kind used to track fugitives. Peter immediately led his group off the ridgeline and into a dense thicket, where they huddled in silence, barely breathing. The barking grew louder, then seemed to circle around them, then gradually faded into the distance. They waited for 2 hours, not moving, before Peter finally decided it was safe to continue. They never learned whether the dogs had been tracking them specifically or were part of a general search, but the incident reinforced the need for absolute caution. The groups maintained minimal contact with each other during the journey. Occasionally, two groups would encounter each other at a planned rendezvous point, where they would exchange information and redistribute supplies. But mostly, they traveled independently, reducing the risk that all would be captured if one group was discovered. On the 8th night, Benjamin's group reached the edge of the mountains. The terrain became steeper, the forests denser, the travel more difficult. But they were also entering territory that was more remote and less likely to be searched. Benjamin felt a cautious optimism that they might actually succeed. The groups began to converge as they approached their destination. The target was a valley that Benjamin and Marcus had identified during their planning. It was located deep in the Alleghenies, accessible only by narrow trails, surrounded by steep ridges that made it naturally defensible. A stream ran through the valley, providing fresh water. The valley floor was relatively flat and appeared suitable for farming. Most importantly, it was remote, miles from the nearest settlement, invisible from any road or traveled route. On the 13th night, March 26, 1847, the first group reached the valley. Benjamin led them down a narrow trail that descended from a ridgeline into the valley floor. As they emerged from the forest into the open space, people stopped and stared. After 13 days of traveling through dense forest, sleeping in thickets and caves, constantly hiding and moving, they had reached a place where they could stop, a place where they could rest, a place where they could begin to build something new. Over the next 2 days, the other groups arrived. By the evening of March 28th, all 250 people had reached the valley. They were exhausted, hungry, and many were injured or ill. But they had made it. They had traveled over 100 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in Virginia, evading search parties and bloodhounds, and had reached their destination. That night, they gathered in the center of the valley for the first time since leaving Riverside. Samuel, the eldest, stood before them and spoke. "We have done what they said was impossible," he said, his voice strong despite his age. "We have freed ourselves. We have traveled through darkness and danger. We have reached this place, but our work is not finished. Now we must build. We must create a home here, a community, a life. We must prove that we can not only escape bondage, but can thrive in freedom. This valley has no name. We have no name. We are people who are not supposed to exist in a place that is not supposed to be here. But we are here, and we will make this work." The people responded with quiet determination. They were too exhausted for celebration, too aware of the challenges ahead. But they had accomplished the first step. They had escaped. They had disappeared. And now they would build. The first weeks in the valley were focused on survival. Shelter was the immediate priority. The weather in late March was unpredictable: cold nights, occasional rain, and the constant threat of late-season snow. People needed protection from the elements. Marcus organized construction teams. Using tools that had been brought from Riverside and others that Joseph fabricated from materials found in the forest, they began building structures. The first buildings were simple: log cabins with mud chinking, thatched roofs and dirt floors. But they were weatherproof and provided shelter. The construction proceeded quickly because of the skills that people brought with them. Marcus's carpentry expertise was crucial, but others contributed as well. Several men had experience with log construction from building and repairing structures at Riverside. Women who had worked in the fields knew how to gather and prepare thatch for roofing. Joseph's metalworking skills allowed him to fabricate hinges, nails, and other hardware from scrap metal. By the end of April, they had completed about 15 structures, enough to house everyone, though conditions were crowded. The buildings were arranged in a rough circle around a central common area, with the stream running along one edge of the settlement. Food was the next priority. The supplies they had brought were nearly exhausted, and foraging alone could not sustain 250 people. They needed to establish agriculture. Jacob, who had managed the vegetable gardens at Riverside, organized farming teams. The valley floor had soil that appeared suitable for cultivation, though it would need to be cleared of trees and undergrowth. They began the laborious process of clearing land, using axes and saws to fell trees and fire to clear brush. Planting began in early May. They had brought some seeds from Riverside, beans, corn, squash, and other vegetables. These were planted in the cleared areas. They also identified wild plants in the surrounding forests that could be cultivated, berries, nuts, and edible roots. Hunting and fishing supplemented their diet. Several men who had experience hunting at Riverside organized hunting parties that ranged into the surrounding forests. The streams in the valley and the nearby river provided fish. Esther's knowledge of edible plants helped them identify additional food sources. Water was abundant. The stream that ran through the valley provided fresh water year-round. They dug a central well in the common area to provide easier access and to ensure water would be available even if the stream froze in winter. As the basic needs of shelter and food were addressed, attention turned to organization and governance. The community needed structure, rules, and systems for making decisions. Samuel, Marcus, Ruth, Dinah, and several others formed an informal council that met regularly to address problems and make decisions. They established basic rules. Everyone would contribute to the community's work according to their abilities. Resources would be shared equitably. Disputes would be resolved through discussion and consensus rather than force. And the security of the community would be everyone's responsibility. They also established a watch system. The valley's remote location provided some security, but they couldn't assume they were completely safe. Teams of 2 people were assigned to watch the trails leading into the valley, rotating every few hours. If anyone approached, the watchers would sound an alarm, and the community would hide in the forests until the threat passed. Education was another priority. Ruth organized a school for the children, teaching them to read, write, and do basic mathematics. Several adults who had learned to read also attended, eager to acquire skills that had been denied to them at Riverside. The school met in a building that also served as a chapel and community meeting hall. By midsummer, the settlement had taken on the character of a functioning community. The buildings were more substantial, with some structures now having wooden floors and glass windows salvaged from abandoned structures they had found in the surrounding area. The fields were producing vegetables. Hunting and fishing provided regular protein. People had established routines and roles. Children played in the common area. Adults worked during the day and gathered in the evenings to share meals and conversation. But they also remained aware that their situation was precarious. They were fugitives living in a hidden valley in Virginia, a slave state. Discovery would mean recapture and punishment. They maintained strict security, with the watch system operating continuously. They avoided making fires during the day when smoke might be visible from a distance. They kept noise to a minimum, and they constantly discussed what their next step should be. Some argued for staying in the valley permanently, building a self-sufficient community that could exist indefinitely in isolation. Others insisted that staying in Virginia was too dangerous and that they should eventually move north to free territory or Canada. Still others proposed a more radical idea, that they should make contact with abolitionists and use their story to support the anti-slavery cause. These debates continued throughout the summer and fall of 1847, with no clear consensus emerging. Meanwhile, the community continued to grow and develop. By the end of the year, the population had actually increased slightly. Several women who had been pregnant during the escape had given birth, and a few other fugitives, having heard rumors of a hidden settlement, had found their way to the valley and been welcomed into the community. The settlement had no official name. People referred to it simply as the valley or the place. This anonymity was intentional. A name would make it more real, more findable, more vulnerable. They were a community that existed in the spaces between maps, a town that had no name because it wasn't supposed to exist, but exist it did. Through the summer and fall of 1847, through the winter of 1847-1848, and into the spring and summer of 1848, the nameless town thrived. The fields produced good harvests. The buildings were expanded and improved. The school educated children and adults. The community developed traditions and celebrations. People who had lived their entire lives in bondage were learning what it meant to be free. And then, in the fall of 1849, hunters stumbled upon the valley. The hunters were 3 men from a town about 30 miles to the north. They had been tracking a deer and had followed it into territory they had never explored before. They descended into the valley and found themselves staring at a settlement that, according to everything they knew, shouldn't exist. The watchers saw the hunters before the hunters saw the settlement. The alarm was sounded, a specific pattern of whistles that carried through the valley. People immediately stopped what they were doing and moved toward the forest, following evacuation plans that had been practiced regularly for exactly this situation. By the time the hunters reached the settlement, it appeared deserted. Buildings stood with doors open. Fires burned in hearths. Food sat on tables. But there were no people visible. The hunters explored cautiously, confused by what they were seeing. The settlement was clearly inhabited. The buildings were well maintained. The fields were cultivated. There were signs of recent activity everywhere. But where were the people? One of the hunters noticed movement in the forest and called out. There was no response. The hunters conferred briefly, then decided to leave. This was strange, possibly dangerous, and definitely something they should report to authorities. They left the valley and returned to their town. Within days, word of the mysterious settlement had spread. Within a week, a militia force had been organized to investigate. Within 2 weeks, the militia arrived at the valley. The settlement was empty. Not deserted in the sense that people had just stepped away temporarily, as it had appeared to the hunters. Empty in the sense that it had been deliberately abandoned. The buildings stood intact, but personal items were gone. The fields showed signs of recent harvest. The fires were cold, and there was no indication of where the inhabitants had gone. The militia searched the surrounding area for days, finding nothing. No trails, no campsites, no signs of a large group moving through the forest. It was as if the people had simply vanished, just as they had vanished from Riverside Plantation 2.5 years earlier. The authorities ordered the settlement destroyed. The buildings were burned, the fields were trampled, and efforts were made to erase all evidence that the town had ever existed. The location was noted in official reports, but these reports were not made public. The incident was embarrassing. A hidden community of fugitives had existed for over 2 years in Virginia without being detected. Better to destroy the evidence and forget it had happened. But what actually happened to the people? How did they disappear a second time? The answer lies in the warning system and evacuation plans that the community had maintained since its founding. When the hunters were spotted, the alarm was sounded. People immediately evacuated to pre-designated hiding places in the forests surrounding the valley. They remained hidden while the hunters explored the settlement, then waited until the hunters left. But the council recognized that discovery was now inevitable. The hunters would report what they had found. Authorities would investigate. The valley was no longer safe. Over the next 2 weeks, while the hunters were spreading word of their discovery, and while the militia was being organized, the community executed a second exodus. This time, they had the advantage of preparation. They had supplies, tools, and experience. They had identified multiple potential destinations during their 2 years in the valley, and they had established contacts with networks of people who helped fugitives. The community split into smaller groups, each heading in a different direction. Some went north, toward Pennsylvania and Ohio. Some went west, toward the territories. Some went south, paradoxically, to free black communities in cities where they could blend in and disappear into urban populations. And some, according to later accounts, went even deeper into the mountains, to other hidden valleys that they had scouted as potential backup locations. The groups left at different times over the course of 2 weeks, ensuring that no single large movement would be noticed. They took everything they could carry and destroyed or hid everything else. By the time the militia arrived, the valley had been empty for several days. This second disappearance was even more complete than the first. The groups scattered so widely and blended so thoroughly into their destinations that tracking them became impossible. Some individuals later appeared in historical records under different names in different locations, but the community as a whole ceased to exist as a unified entity. The nameless town had served its purpose. It had provided a safe haven for 2.5 years, long enough for people to recover from their escape, to learn to live in freedom, and to make plans for their futures. And when it was no longer safe, they had the skills and experience to disappear again. While the nameless town was thriving in its hidden valley, Colonel Thomas Brennan was conducting his investigation into the original disappearance from Riverside Plantation. His investigation, which lasted from March 1847 through the summer of that year, was exhaustive and frustrating in equal measure. Brennan was a methodical man, trained in military intelligence during his service in the Mexican-American War. He approached the Riverside case with the same systematic methodology he had used to track deserters and enemy movements during the war. But the Riverside case defied his methods at every turn. His first step was to document everything about the plantation and the disappearance. He interviewed the Hargrove family multiple times, taking detailed notes on their observations and routines. He interviewed Gerald Pritchard, the overseer, extensively. He examined the quarters, the tunnel, the plantation's records, and every piece of physical evidence he could find. He quickly determined that the disappearance had been meticulously planned over an extended period. The tunnel alone proved that. But how had such an extensive project been kept secret? Brennan calculated that the tunnel would have required thousands of hours of labor. Where had the excavated earth gone? How had the tools been obtained? How had the work been concealed? He found partial answers to some of these questions. The excavated earth had been dispersed across the plantation in small quantities, mixed with legitimate agricultural work. The tools had been fabricated in the blacksmith shop or diverted from plantation supplies in quantities too small to be noticed individually. The work had been done at night, during times when the overseer was unlikely to be watching closely. But these answers only led to more questions. How had 250 people maintained absolute secrecy about the project? How had they coordinated their efforts? How had they prevented anyone from revealing the plan, either deliberately or accidentally? Brennan interviewed neighbors, merchants in Richmond who had done business with the plantation, and anyone else who might have observed something unusual. He found nothing. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary at Riverside in the years before the disappearance. He pursued the river theory, searching for evidence that the fugitives had escaped by boat. He found none. He investigated the possibility that they had fled by road, interviewing people at every town and crossroads within 50 miles. No one had seen a large group of people matching the description of the Riverside population. He brought in tracking dogs, which refused to follow any trail. He organized search parties that combed the forests and fields around the plantation. They found nothing. By May 1847, Brennan was forced to conclude that the fugitives had somehow traveled to a destination that was not being searched. But where? North seemed most likely, but his inquiries to authorities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other free states had produced no sightings. Canada was possible, but the distance seemed impossible for such a large group to travel undetected. It was in early June that he received the anonymous letter that mentioned the town that has no name and suggested looking in the mountains of Western Virginia. Brennan's initial reaction was skepticism. Why would fugitives stay in Virginia? It made no strategic sense. But the letter's mention of traveling beneath the earth troubled him. The writer clearly knew about the tunnel. And if the writer knew about the tunnel, they might know about the destination as well. Brennan decided to investigate. He assembled a small team, 3 men he trusted, and headed west into the Alleghenies. He had no specific destination, only the vague instruction to look for a hidden settlement in the mountains. The search took 3 weeks. They explored remote valleys, followed rumors and hints from people they encountered, and gradually worked their way deeper into the mountains. And then, in late June 1847, they found it. The discovery of the nameless town was the culmination of Brennan's investigation, but it also presented him with an impossible dilemma. His duty was clear. Report the location, facilitate the return of the fugitives to their legal owner. But standing in that valley, seeing what these people had built, understanding the years of planning and courage that had brought them there, he found his certainty wavering. His conversation with Marcus, the carpenter who had designed the tunnel and led the escape, was the most extraordinary of his life. Marcus explained the planning, the execution, and the philosophy behind the escape with remarkable candor. He didn't plead or beg. He simply explained, as one intelligent man to another, what they had done and why. "We're not asking for your approval," Marcus said. "We're not asking for your help. We're simply asking that you consider what you found here before you decide what to do with that knowledge." Brennan asked questions. How had they maintained secrecy? "Trust," Marcus replied. "We trusted each other completely, and we understood that our survival depended on that trust." How had they coordinated such a complex operation? Careful planning, years of preparation, and a willingness to work together toward a common goal. What did they plan to do next? Survive, build, and eventually find a way to help others do the same. Brennan spent 2 days in the valley, observing the community, talking with people, trying to understand what he had found. He saw children learning to read in Ruth's school. He saw fields being cultivated. He saw people working together, making decisions collectively, building something that resembled the democratic ideals he had fought for in the war. On the 3rd day, he made his decision. He would return to Richmond and file a report stating that his investigation had reached a dead end. The fugitives had scattered and could not be located. The case should be closed. Marcus asked him why he was making this choice. Brennan's answer was simple. "Because what you've done here is more important than the law that says you shouldn't have done it. I don't know if that makes me a traitor to my duty or true to my principles, but I know that I can't be the one to destroy this." Brennan kept his word. His official report, filed in July 1847, stated that the investigation had been exhaustive but unsuccessful. The fugitives had vanished completely, likely having scattered in multiple directions and integrated into free black communities in the north. He recommended that the case be closed and the insurance claims be paid. But Brennan also kept detailed private records of everything he had found, including the location of the valley and his conversations with Marcus and others. These records, discovered after his death in 1873, provide the most complete account of what happened at Riverside and in the nameless town. Brennan continued to monitor the situation after his official investigation ended. He maintained contact with people who might have information about the settlement. He learned of its continued existence through 1848 and into 1849. And he learned of its discovery by hunters and the second disappearance in the fall of 1849. His private papers express both admiration for what the community accomplished and sadness that it could not be sustained. They proved that people who had been treated as property could organize themselves, govern themselves, and thrive in freedom, he wrote. That they were forced to disappear again is a tragedy, but not a failure. They succeeded in the most important sense. They freed themselves and lived as free people, even if only for a short time. What happened to specific individuals after the second disappearance is largely a matter of speculation and fragmentary evidence. Historical records from the 1850s and beyond contain tantalizing hints, but definitive proof is elusive. A Marcus Freeman registered as a carpenter in Toronto, Canada, in 1851. The registration records describe him as a man in his 50s, skilled in furniture making and architectural carpentry, originally from Virginia. The description matches Marcus from Riverside, but the surname Freeman was common among formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom, so this could be coincidence. However, records show that Marcus Freeman of Toronto had a wife named Hannah and 3 children, Rachel, Sarah, and David, which matches the family structure of Marcus from Riverside exactly. Adina Roberts opened a boarding house in Philadelphia in 1853. City directory listings describe her as a woman of color, originally from Virginia, operating a respectable establishment that catered to travelers and long-term residents. The boarding house was located in a neighborhood with a substantial free black population, and Dinah Roberts was noted in local records as being active in community organizations and the Underground Railroad. Again, the name is common enough that definitive identification is impossible, but the details are suggestive. A Benjamin Wright enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in 1863, one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army. Military records describe him as being in his late 30s, originally from Virginia, with experience handling horses and wagons. He survived the war and was mustered out in 1865. Post-war records show a Benjamin Wright settling in Massachusetts and working as a teamster. He married in 1866 and had 4 children. In a pension application filed in 1890, he mentioned having escaped from bondage in Virginia in 1847, which matches the timeline of the Riverside disappearance. An Esther Johnson appears in records from Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1850s, working as a midwife and healer. She was described as a woman of color, originally from South Carolina, with extensive knowledge of herbal medicine. She was active in the local African Methodist Episcopal Church and was known for providing medical care to the city's black community. The geographic origin, South Carolina, and the profession, midwifery and healing, match Esther from Riverside. Samuel, the eldest of the Riverside community, likely did not survive long after the escape. He would have been in his late 60s by 1849, and the rigors of 2 escapes and 2 years of building a settlement in a remote valley would have been extremely taxing. No records have been found that definitively identify him in later years, suggesting he may have died in the valley or shortly after the second disappearance. Ruth appears in records from a black church in Pittsburgh in the 1850s, where a woman named Ruth Williams served as a teacher and Sunday school organizer. The description matches Ruth from Riverside in terms of age and skills, but again, definitive proof is lacking. Joseph the blacksmith may have settled in Cincinnati, where records show a Joseph Miller working as a metal worker in the 1850s and 1860s. Cincinnati had a substantial free black population and was a major hub of the Underground Railroad, making it a logical destination for fugitives from Virginia. These fragmentary records suggest that many of the people from Riverside successfully integrated into free black communities in the North and went on to live productive lives. They changed their names, obscured their origins, and blended into populations where they could live in relative safety. Some, like Benjamin Wright, even served in the Union Army during the Civil War, fighting to end the system they had escaped. But these are only the individuals who left traces in historical records. Many others, perhaps the majority, left no documentary evidence of their later lives. They lived quietly, worked in occupations that didn't generate official records, and passed on their stories only through oral tradition within their families and communities. While official historical records contain only fragments and hints about what happened to the people of Riverside, oral traditions in certain African American communities preserve much more detailed accounts. These oral histories, passed down through generations, tell stories that align remarkably well with the documented facts of the Riverside disappearance. In several communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Canada, there are family stories about ancestors who came from the place with no name or who disappeared twice before finding freedom. These stories describe a large group of people who escaped from a Virginia plantation through a tunnel, lived for a time in a hidden valley in the mountains, and then scattered when the valley was discovered. The details in these oral traditions are often specific and consistent across different families and communities. They describe the tunnel as being long enough to walk through for the time it takes to say the Lord's Prayer 3 times, which would be approximately 10 minutes, matching the documented length of the Riverside Tunnel. They describe the valley as being surrounded by mountains like a bowl with a stream running through it, which matches the geography of the location Brennan documented. The oral traditions also preserve details about the planning and execution of the escape that aren't found in official records. They describe how the community practiced moving through the tunnel during nighttime religious gatherings, how children were taught to be silent through games and exercises, how food was accumulated over years through careful management of plantation resources, and how the route to the mountains was scouted and memorized by people who had legitimate reasons to travel. These oral histories also provide insights into the emotional and psychological aspects of the escape that official documents can't capture. They describe the fear of discovery during the years of planning, the terror of moving through the tunnel not knowing if it would collapse, the exhaustion of the 13-day journey to the mountains, the joy of reaching the valley, and the heartbreak of having to leave it when it was discovered. One particularly detailed oral tradition, preserved in a family in Toronto, describes the night of the escape from the perspective of a child who was 7 years old at the time. The account describes being woken in the middle of the night, being told to be absolutely silent, being carried through a dark tunnel that seemed to go on forever, and then walking through forests for many nights while adults whispered reassurances. The child remembered reaching a valley where there were other children to play with, where there was a school and where adults seemed happy for the first time. And then, the child remembered, they had to leave again, and this time the journey took them to a city where there were many people and tall buildings, and a sense of safety that the valley, for all its beauty, had never quite provided. These oral traditions serve as a counterpoint to the official historical record, which focuses on the mystery and the investigation but largely ignores the human experience of the people who lived through these events. The oral histories remind us that the Riverside disappearance wasn't just a historical puzzle to be solved. It was a lived experience for 250 people who made impossible choices, took extraordinary risks, and changed the course of their own lives and the lives of their descendants. The Riverside disappearance and the nameless town were not unique, though they were unusually well documented due to Brennan's investigation and private papers. Historical research suggests that similar hidden communities existed in remote locations throughout the South during the antebellum period. The Great Dismal Swamp, straddling the border between Virginia and North Carolina, was known to harbor communities of fugitives who lived in the swamp's interior, beyond the reach of slave catchers. The Appalachian Mountains contained numerous remote valleys that could have sheltered hidden settlements. The Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia, the bayous of Louisiana, and the forests of eastern Texas all had areas remote enough to conceal communities of people who had escaped bondage. These communities were typically small, a few dozen people at most, and were often temporary, lasting only a few years before being discovered or before the inhabitants moved on to more permanent freedom in the North or Canada. But they served crucial functions. They provided safe havens for people fleeing bondage. They demonstrated that self-governance and self-sufficiency were possible. And they served as nodes in the broader network of resistance to slavery. The nameless town in the Virginia mountains was unusual primarily in its size and in the completeness of its disappearance from the original plantation. Most escapes involved individuals or small groups. The coordination required to move 250 people simultaneously was extraordinary. But the underlying strategy, creating a hidden community in a remote location, was part of a broader pattern of resistance. The networks that supported these communities were extensive and sophisticated. Free black communities in cities provided resources, information, and contacts. Quaker communities and other religious groups opposed to slavery provided material support and safe houses. Even some white Southerners who were uncomfortable with slavery, though they might not actively oppose it, would sometimes turn a blind eye to fugitives passing through their areas. The Underground Railroad, which has become the most famous symbol of resistance to slavery, was only one part of this broader network. The Underground Railroad primarily facilitated movement from south to north, helping individuals and small groups reach free territory. But there were also networks that supported hidden communities within the South, providing them with supplies, information, and warnings about threats. The Riverside Escape and the Nameless Town were products of these networks. The anonymous letter that led Brennan to the valley suggests that someone outside the community knew of its existence and was willing to reveal it, perhaps because they believed documentation was important. Perhaps because they wanted to ensure the story would be preserved, even if the community itself could not be sustained. Why was the story of Riverside and the Nameless Town suppressed? Why were Brennan's findings sealed? Why were the documents scattered across different archives where they would be difficult to connect? The answer lies in the political and economic context of the late 1840s. The United States was deeply divided over the question of slavery. The Mexican-American War had just ended, and debates over whether new territories would be slave or free were intensifying. The Compromise of 1850 was being negotiated, attempting to balance the interests of slave and free states. In this context, the Riverside case was politically explosive. It demonstrated that enslaved people could organize sophisticated resistance, could plan and execute complex operations, and could establish functioning communities in freedom. These were precisely the things that defenders of slavery insisted were impossible. The ideology of slavery depended on the claim that enslaved people were incapable of self-governance, that they needed the guidance of their owners, that they were better off in bondage than they would be in freedom. The Nameless Town disproved all of these claims. For 2.5 years, 250 people who had been treated as property had governed themselves, built a community, educated their children, and thrived. This was dangerous knowledge. For the Hargrove family and other plantation owners, the Riverside case was also economically threatening. The insurance companies had paid out substantial claims for the loss of the Riverside population. If it became widely known that such large-scale escapes were possible, insurance rates would increase dramatically, making the economics of slavery less profitable. Moreover, the case demonstrated that even well-treated enslaved people, the Hargroves had considered themselves enlightened owners, would choose freedom if given the opportunity. This undermined the paternalistic justifications for slavery. For state and federal authorities, the case was embarrassing. Despite extensive searches involving state militia, federal marshals, and private investigators, the fugitives had never been recaptured. The discovery and subsequent second disappearance of the Nameless Town made the authorities look incompetent. Better to seal the records and let the case fade from public memory. So the documents were scattered. Brennan's official report went to state archives. His private papers remained with his family and weren't discovered until after his death. The insurance company records were filed away in corporate archives. The Hargrove family's records were eventually donated to the Virginia Historical Society, but without the context provided by Brennan's investigation, they appeared to be simply the records of a plantation that had experienced a mass escape. Unusual, but not unprecedented. It wasn't until the late 20th century when historians began systematically researching resistance to slavery and when archives began to be digitized and cross-referenced that the full story of Riverside and the Nameless Town began to emerge. Even now, significant gaps remain. The exact location of the valley has never been definitively identified, though several sites in the Alleghenies match Brennan's description. The fate of most of the individuals remains unknown, and the full extent of the networks that supported the escape and the hidden community remains a matter of speculation. Despite over 170 years of historical distance and modern research techniques, significant questions about the riverside disappearance and the nameless town remain unanswered. How was the tunnel construction kept absolutely secret for 4 years? The disposal of excavated earth has been partially explained, but the logistics remain unclear. Thousands of cubic feet of earth had to be moved, dispersed, and concealed. The work had to be done at night in secret by people who were also performing full days of labor. The physical and organizational challenges seem almost insurmountable, yet they were overcome. How? How was information controlled so effectively? 250 people knew about the escape plan, at least in general terms. Yet there's no evidence that anyone revealed the plan to the Hargroves or the overseer, either deliberately or accidentally, in a population that included children, elderly individuals, and people who might have been tempted to curry favor with their owners. How was absolute secrecy maintained? Who wrote the anonymous letter to Brennan? The handwriting was educated, suggesting someone with formal schooling. Marcus is the most likely candidate, but why would he risk revealing the town's location? One theory is that he wanted the story documented, wanted proof that what they had accomplished was real, even if that proof couldn't be made public at the time. Another theory is that the letter came from someone in the support network, someone who believed that Brennan could be trusted and that having an official, if private, record of the community's existence was important. What happened during the second disappearance? How did 400 people, the population had grown from the original 250, vanish so completely that the militia found no trace of their departure? The explanation that they split into small groups and left over a 2-week period is plausible, but the logistics of coordinating such a dispersal, especially with the knowledge that authorities were coming, seem extraordinarily complex. Where exactly was the valley? Brennan's private papers describe its location in general terms, in the Alleghenies, accessible by narrow trails surrounded by steep ridges, but don't provide specific coordinates or landmarks that would allow definitive identification. Several valleys in the region match the description, and local historians have speculated about which one might have been the site of the nameless town. But without archaeological evidence, which would be difficult to find given that the structures were burned and the site was deliberately obscured, the exact location remains unknown. Did other hidden communities exist? The oral traditions and fragmentary historical evidence suggest that the nameless town was not unique, that other hidden settlements existed in remote locations throughout the South. But if these communities were successful in remaining hidden, they would have left little or no documentary evidence. How many other towns that have no name existed? How many other mass escapes were executed with such precision that they seemed impossible? We may never know. What was the long-term impact of the Riverside escape on the broader resistance to slavery? Did the techniques developed for the Riverside escape, the tunnel, the coordinated mass movement, the hidden settlement, influence other resistance efforts? There are hints in the historical record that similar methods were used in other cases, but direct connections are difficult to prove. The suppression of the Riverside story means that it couldn't serve as an open example or inspiration, but information could have spread through the networks that supported resistance to slavery. The story of how 250 people disappeared from Riverside Plantation in 1 hour and built their own town is, at its core, a story about human capability, courage, and the drive for freedom. It's a story about Marcus, a carpenter who used his skills to design and build a tunnel that made the impossible possible. About Samuel, an elder who preserved knowledge and wisdom that guided the community. About Dinah, who used her position to accumulate resources and information. About Benjamin, who learned the geography that would lead them to safety. About Esther, who provided medical care that kept people alive. About Ruth, who organized and educated. About Joseph, who fabricated the tools they needed. And about dozens of others whose names we don't know, but whose contributions were essential. It's a story about planning and patience, 4 years of digging a tunnel in secret. Years of accumulating supplies in quantities too small to be noticed. Years of scouting routes and making contacts. Years of building trust and maintaining secrecy. The escape wasn't spontaneous or lucky. It was the result of meticulous preparation and extraordinary discipline. It's a story about community and cooperation. 250 people working together toward a common goal, trusting each other completely, supporting each other through danger and hardship. The escape succeeded not because of individual heroism, though there was plenty of that, but because of collective action and mutual support. It's a story about resilience and adaptation. When the nameless town was discovered, the community didn't surrender or despair. They executed a second disappearance, scattered to new locations, and continued their lives in freedom. They had learned that freedom wasn't a destination, but a continuous process of resistance, adaptation, and survival. And it's a story about the power of suppression and the importance of memory. The official historical record tried to erase this story, to make it disappear as completely as the people themselves had disappeared. But the story survived in private papers, in oral traditions, in fragmentary records scattered across archives. It survived because people believed it was important, because they understood that what happened at Riverside and in the nameless town was significant not just for those who lived through it, but for everyone who came after. The story challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about slavery and resistance. It demonstrates that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who could plan, organize, and execute sophisticated operations. It shows that communities could be built and sustained even in the most difficult circumstances. And it reminds us that the historical record is incomplete, that there are stories that have been deliberately suppressed or accidentally lost, and that recovering these stories is essential to understanding our past. The tunnel at Riverside has long since been filled in. The valley where the nameless town stood has returned to forest. The people who orchestrated and executed the escape have been dead for over a century, but their story remains, preserved in documents and memories, a testament to what people can accomplish when survival demands the impossible. They were there, and then they weren't. 250 people who disappeared in an hour and built a town that existed for 2 years before disappearing again. A mystery that baffled investigators at the time and continues to fascinate historians today. A story that was supposed to be forgotten, but that refuses to be erased. And somewhere in those mountains, if you know where to look, you can still find traces. Foundations hidden under decades of leaf litter. Depressions in the ground where buildings once stood. The remnants of a community that existed in the spaces between maps, built by people who were never supposed to be free in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. They proved it was possible. They disappeared, they built, they thrived, and they disappeared again. And in doing so, they left a legacy that extends far beyond the 2.5 years that the nameless town existed. They demonstrated that freedom could be taken, not just granted. That communities could be built by people who had been denied the right to build. That the impossible could be achieved through planning, courage, and collective action. The official records say the case was closed in August 1847, that the fugitives were never found, that the mystery was never solved. But that's not quite true. The mystery was solved. Brennan solved it. He found the nameless town. He spoke with the people who had built it. He documented what they had accomplished. He just chose not to reveal what he had found. He chose to let them keep their freedom, to let their town exist for as long as it could, to let their story remain hidden until a time when it could be told without endangering anyone. That time has come. The people of Riverside and the nameless town are long gone, but their story can finally be told. Not as a legend or a myth, but as a historical fact. 250 people disappeared from one plantation in 1 hour. They traveled through a tunnel they had spent 4 years building. They journeyed for 13 days through forests and mountains. They built a town in a hidden valley. They lived there for 2.5 years, and when that town was discovered, they disappeared again, scattering to new lives in new places. It happened. The records prove it. And the fact that it happened, that it was possible, that it was accomplished, matters more than any of the questions that remain unanswered. They did the impossible, and in doing so, they changed what we understand to be possible.